an enormous pleasure for me to to welcome you to this event at the Center for Constitutional Transitions at NYU Law. My name is Sujit Chowdhury, and I'm the director of the center here, and I teach at the law school. And the occasion for our panel is the publication of Zaid Al-Ali's new book, The Struggle for Iraq's Future, How Corruption, Incompetence, and Sectarianism Have Undermined Democracy, and I have it here. And we urge you to all buy it online on Amazon. And so to mark the occasion of the publication of Zaid's book, we have a book panel. And normally I say for book panels that we have a readers meet authors panel, author panel. But in this case, we have an authors meet authors panel because our two panelists have written noted books on Iraqi constitutional politics. And so, in fact, I think at the table here we have the three authors of the leading books on Iraqi constitutional politics. And so I'll begin by introducing our panel and then explain how we'll proceed today. So to my right is my colleague Andrew Arato, who is the Dorothy Hart Hirshon Professor of Political and Social Theory at the New School. He is the author of Constitution Making Under Occupation, The Politics of Imposed Revolution in Iraq from Columbia, 2009. To my far left is Haider Hamoudi, who is an associate professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and he is the author of Negotiating in Civil Conflict, Imperfect Bargaining and Constitutional Construction in Iraq, which was published by Chicago late last year, I think.
That's right.
And then to my immediate left is Zaid Al-Ali, who is senior advisor in constitution building at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. He's based in Cairo, and like Haider, he's also Iraqi. And he is the author of the book that we are discussing today, although I'm sure we'll discuss all of our authors' work. So how we'll proceed is this. So Haider has kindly agreed to speak for about 10 minutes to open up our panel. He'll be followed by Andrew, who will speak for about 10 minutes, and then Zaid will offer his remarks, and then we'll take that as a launching pad for a discussion with our audience and among the panelists. Okay. So Haider, please.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Sujit. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm honestly honored to be on such an illustrious panel and to be associated with the two excellent books that were produced by Zaid and Andrew, respectively. I really enjoyed reading Zaid's book. I was expecting something that was going to be another contribution on constitutionalism per se, and Zaid does something I think that's more valuable, which is to take a pastiche of disciplines, economics and political science, a little bit of sociology, a little bit of law, and sort of throw them together in a way that makes that really tells a story about the tragedy of Iraq today, and it makes a number of different contributions that I think are important, from the little things like the fact that when Nouri al-Maliki sidelines a political opponent who's Sunni, unlike what the New York Times seems to think, this isn't some attempt to remove a rival and take his position, because in a parliamentary system, the rival is just going to be replaced by somebody else. Surely the people who are going to vote for him aren't going to vote for Maliki, but rather increases sectarian tension. I think it's an important insight. It's a small one, but it's just one that appears on a page and that is really important. To the considerable, and one of the considerable ones, I think, is the focus on environmentalism, something that really has not received the attention that is due. There has been some attention to the marshes, but not nearly enough to broader questions of environmentalism, both respecting waterways as well as the very debilitating dust storms that occur throughout Iraq. One thing that Zaid says throughout is to lay a lot of blame on the elites for being, and mostly exile-based, for being out of touch, for being incompetent, for not having the skills necessary to address the matters at hand, nepotistic. If I didn't say corrupt, I'll say it again. It doesn't matter because they're double corrupt anyway. points to a lot of the failures of contemporary Iraq on this basis. In particular, for example, Zaid points out that sectarianism itself is much stronger among the exile groups than it is among people, and that perhaps this has created some increased level of sectarian tension that has, caused some level of paralysis in the debates over questions like federalism and questions like the role of Islam in Iraq. And to point to the fact that people don't have these same tendencies, as Zaid points out, particularly in the last chapter, how Kurds don't seem to have a problem going to Arab areas. Arabs feel very happy when they go up to the north. They use Kurdish hospitals, and there isn't this this hostility that you see in other parts of the world as between peoples. That's true, and certainly the historical aspect of it, that there's some necessitarian conflict, is a little overstated. I do think it is important, however, when one considers sectarian tensions, to look less, or to paraphrase my own legal idol, Carl Llewellyn, to focus a little bit less on what people say and a little more on what people do. That is to say, it is true that if people aren't talking about politics, they do have a fairly easier time getting along, and there isn't that sort of interpersonal hatred. At the same time, my sense of the Kurds, for example, if we could sort of take three different groups, is that they are passionately committed to a very autonomous region. In fact, my impression of the Kurds is that they'd really prefer to be independent, but that it just doesn't really work out that way. I am aware of the IRI and NDI studies that have different polling data, although the way the question was asked there is somewhat suspect. In any event, certainly there's a passionate commitment to that. The way I think that is because, while I completely agree with Zaid that the dominant parties no longer have a stranglehold and a monopoly, even the opposition parties, whether they're Goran, the Change Party, or even the Kurdish Communist Party, when it comes to the Kurdish sacred cows of autonomy, Kirkuk, even control of oil fields, which I think was actually quite important during negotiations. After all, Peter Galbraith, who had a fair amount of money at stake, was negotiating for the Kurds, and so I'm pretty sure he had something to say about that. In all of these cases, I think the parties across the Kurdish spectrum have proven fairly uniform on these points, as much as they might disagree on other points. When I look to, and I don't want to make this too sectarian, but when I look to Sunnis as well as the Shia, perhaps secular elite, that's where nationalism has penetrated the most. And certainly you see this sort of idea of centralism being much stronger, the passionate commitment to Iraq as the nation state, and the suspicion, particularly in this case among Sunnis, the suspicion that institutions like Najaf, like the Kurdish language, are in some way, because they're particularist, detract from national sentiment. This isn't a position that's unique, obviously, among Iraq Sunnis. Centralists the world over, anytime that someone speaks a different language or adheres to an institution that isn't national, get a little bit riled up. And then I see a large portion of the Shia who view their loyalties as being absolutely national, but at the same time view a very important role for Islam in the state. And some Sunnis will do that too, but what makes the Shia unique is the association of Najaf with that Islamic role. That is to say that Najaf is the voice of what Islam and of what Islamic law and the Sharia in particular is supposed to be, and the evidence I see of that is the overwhelming popularity of Ayatollah Sistani, even on questions, by the way, not relating to Sharia themselves. In fact, if anything, Sistani on Sharia is far more flexible, has proved far more flexible than he has on majoritarianism, which really isn't an Islamic doctrine, but on his majoritarianism, something that Andrew points out correctly in his book, there was some level of inflexibility on the side of the Grand Ayatollah. So when I look at this, I do see largely incompatible visions of the state. That isn't to say that there isn't a connection to Iraq or a dedication to Iraq, particularly among Shia and Sunni, but even to some extent among Kurds, but that the way in which they envision this state existing is quite different. And so I do wonder, even if we didn't have these elites, and I'm not trying to exonerate the elites, by the way, I think Zaid's descriptions are very well written, very persuasive, in my opinion, accurate. But even if we didn't have these, and we imagine different political representatives, or if we took some of the suggestions that Zaid provides at his end, would we not sort of end up in the same position that we're in, at least with respect to constitution making, which has been my focus? Wouldn't we sort of be forced into these sort of broad and very vague formulations respecting federalism and oil and gas and the role of Islam in the state, because there are these strong divisions? I would agree that there's divisions over federalism. I would say that the divisions over federalism in Iraq are not terribly different than the divisions in Spain over federalism. I mean, obviously in Spain they're not killing each other, but at the same time they were in the Civil War, and the factions are largely the same, right? So it's, you have a successful constitution-making process, and yet you still have division, and this division is managed through some level of vague formulation. So while obviously you can't just sit there, you need to build trust and you need to build intercooperation. And if these communities are going to live together, they need to figure out a way to do this. I do wonder the extent to which we wouldn't end up in the same precise position that we are with respect to sort of core foundational documents, and what we would be left with is the need and the importance of sort of trying to figure out ways to work incrementally towards a solution. I would say the same thing probably for Islam in the state. That is to say, I agree with Zaid that there isn't very much dialogue on the role that religion should play in the state in Iraq. I kind of think of that as a good thing. I tend to think discussions of that nature are kind of like discussions between Muslims and Christians over whether Jesus Christ is the Son of God or the appointed prophet of Allah. I don't, from a political perspective, see any benefit to these kinds of discussions. It does seem to me that what that shows, if anything, is that this sort of muddling through process might be a way forward. I don't mean to suggest, again, well, first of all, I certainly don't mean to suggest the elites have been muddling their way forward. They haven't been. But what I'm wondering is, rather than saying let's completely reformulate in the way that Zaid suggests, maybe what we need to do is just sort of start taking steps into correct directions, while at the same time aware of some of the constraints that continue to exist. So I'll wrap up with that.
All right. Thank you very much. Andrew.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much, Zaid, for inviting me, which is a great opportunity because since about 2008, when I was finished writing about a process that ended really in 2006, I have not been working on Iraq, and this allowed me to read not just one, but two terrific books on the subject. Actually, one of them was late in coming, and so I had ample time in studying the one I already had, namely Haider's book, and the two together gave me the idea for what I would do here most productively, because I have no new research to contribute to their much more recent research than mine. I mean, both volumes, The Struggle for Iraq's Future and Negotiating Civil Conflict, are terrific volumes, exciting, well-written, well-argued, full of new information, theoretically both interesting. But my problem was, after having read them, is that they seem to occupy alternative universes. I mean, we get two narratives, which now Haider's presentation doesn't fully indicate what his narrative is, although there were hints. We have two narratives, one of which is a story of political crisis and decline. This is Zaid's presentation. There is a brief moment when there was a chance for something different in his argument, but he thinks that the overall structure and the habits of the political elites have made a positive outcome impossible, and so the thing continues to decline. Haider's presentation, contrary to some extent to my predictions, as he is kind enough to point out, presents a relatively positive, certainly not ideal constitutional development, but a relatively positive constitutional development that utilizes really the only method that is available in deeply divided societies, namely incremental constitution making. You called it muddling through just now, but I think the term that you use is incremental constitution making, involving making a capacious constitution. You interesting follow a student of Jean's and mine, Hannah Lerner, in that, and it's a kind of peculiarity that she developed this particular theory for Israel, But that need not concern us, because I think you really have the Indian model more in mind than her particular, I think, apologetic treatment of the Israeli development. But nevertheless, I think under these conditions, namely the deep divisions that the two of you disagree about, and I'm not the one to tell you which of you is right, under the conditions of those deep divisions, this is about the best you can do. And in fact, you do point to some successes. You also point, it's not an apology, you point also to severe problems about which the two of you agree, namely, basically, the absence of checks and balances to majoritarianism and executive dominance. But you also point to many positive developments. We don't have to go through that because I want to stay within the time limit. But on the basis of these alternative universes, I'd like to address the two of you some questions. I think it might be the best, most productive contribution I can make here. So the first question is to both of you. Is it theoretically possible for a constitutional project to succeed while a political community is in almost constant crisis and decline? When state formation is constantly in doubt? When neither state nor community are truly constituted? The second question is to Zaid. Is the dark outcome you described, was it inevitable? You deny that it was inevitable because of ethnic division and antagonism that you don't consider, as we just heard, fundamental or deep enough in Iraq. But were those developments inevitable under the circumstance of an externally imposed regime change come externally empowered elite, both exacerbating and rigidifying whatever ethnic divisions there were? Most importantly, was it possible to affect the outcome through constitution-making process? If yes, what should have been done? If not, why would you be optimistic at all now? I don't think your book ends on an optimistic note, but it still points to the possibility of doing something. Why is it possible? Why is it going to be possible now if it wasn't possible back then? My third question is to Haider. Does a severely flawed process have consequences you admit for either the Constitution made or its subsequent legitimacy? Or is it the case, as some people have recently argued, I think Sujit and I would disagree with that process just does not matter? Is the relative success that you point to, for example, on the level of the symbolic Constitution, due to the positive features of the process at one juncture? Or is the process not really responsible for anything? It's what you put into a constitution what matters. But if that is the case, I find it interesting that you actually make, as it turns out, and I make many wrong predictions, so I don't mean to say this against you in any too critical a way, that you make really the wrong prediction about the Egyptian process. Because there you also point to a relatively similar constitution, capacious, full of delays, full of things that have not been decided, and you think basically that this could be the basis of a positive development, incrementally so as in other places. But then what brought it down? I mean, of course, we could just blame it on the military, but I think that would be too easy. Was there anything wrong which actually allowed the military coup to occur? Question 4 is to both of you. And I only have 2 more short ones left. Question 4 is to both of you. You both, in effect, describe the Supreme Court of Iraq as passive or incredibly deferential to the government. You can correct me. I think Zaid is more critical, but in any case, I don't think there's a story of activism or dramatic controls over government coming from the court, even in your story. Does this have anything to do with the failure to establish a new court in 2005 and after, and the arguably strained method of preserving the court established by the previous constitution, the transitional administrative law? Question 5 is to both of you. Is the authoritarian turn in Iraqi government, which according to Zaid is the capture of most institutions by the executive, not a function of a dramatic failure of the 2005 constitution to establish any legitimate checks to the power of the majority and the executive power? And finally, to Haider, is not the relatively consensual outcome of the most divisive issue, namely federalism, a function of constitutional capaciousness is the relatively consensual outcome of the most divisive issue, namely federalism, a function of constitutional capaciousness or of an unexpected political development of the electorate and the Iraqi public in the direction of Iraqi nationalism that would have had the same result even if the constitution would not have been delayed for a moment, but only a moment in a highly suspect way when the decision on region formation occurred. In an interesting episode that you discuss is the famous Bush phone call to Abdulaziz al-Hakim, to which you attribute saving the Iraqi state from what could have been a really destructive outcome. I must admit that I refer to that phone call as laughable and ridiculous, and you disagree with that. But the important question is not the adjectives we use, but whether the delay at that particular moment did anything, since the statute subsequently repassed exactly the same thing that was supposedly delayed. And to Zaid, finally, does not this very development toward a nationalist consensus, which of course is not complete, but which you also point to, the country is more nationalist than its elites. Doesn't this actually provide a basis for some optimism concerning the possibility of a future development? And if not, on what basis do you believe that consensual process could succeed now if it has repeatedly failed in the past? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Wonderful. Zaid.
Okay.
So what I would suggest that this is your first installment.
Okay.
So why don't you offer a kind of a 10-minute installment, and then we will get the discussion going on the panel, because there are a lot of questions to Haider as well, and we'll draw on the audience.
Okay. So there's a lot to get through. So first of all, thanks very much, everyone, for being here, and thanks, of course, to my good friend Sujit for organizing this fantastic event, and thanks to the panelists as well for being here as well. So I'll just quickly, in just a few sentences, just summarize the main argument that I make in the book, just for everyone's reference, and then I'll try to respond to the points. So the main argument that I make is that the constitutional framework, the constitutional system that was established in 2005, is generally not being applied in Iraq. For various reasons, in my view, partly because of the way it was drafted and also partly because of what it says. And I can give you a very precise example of that, is that you've probably heard that the system of government as provided for in the Constitution is federal, at least in intent. It provides for mechanisms that allows for the formation of federal regions, so there are provinces that can currently transform and become federal regions, depending on whether or not certain conditions are met. And if they do become federal regions, that allows them more autonomy vis-a-vis the central government. That's the idea, okay? And as a result of many failures that have taken place from 2005 onwards, many provinces outside of the Kurdistan region, which is the only region in Iraq at the moment, have actually tried to become federal regions. They've thought that their situation is so desperate, so bad, that they've tried to apply the provisions on the formation of federal regions in Iraq to gain more autonomy vis-a-vis the central government. One of the first provinces to do so was Basra province, which is in the south of Iraq. Another province, the Salah ad-Din province, tried to as well, and Diyala also tried to as well, amongst others, not the only ones. Other provinces have as well. And on each occasion, the government reaction was absolutely not, we will not allow you to proceed, okay? Even though the Constitution does not allow the central government any authority, any right to obstruct that process. They've simply refused to apply the Constitution, simply, okay? And in the case of Diyala, it was even more dramatic, because in Diyala, when they decided, or when they started the process or started talking about the formation of a federal region, suddenly the streets of the provincial capital were filled with militiamen. And the government didn't do anything about it. And the provincial council had to flee to Khanaqin, which is a small town which is part of the province but is under the control of the Kurdistan region for various reasons. And that status quo remained in place for weeks, if not months, basically. And the central government didn't do anything about it. They basically had a provincial government in exile from its own province as a result of its mere suggestion that they should be applying the Constitution. That's how dramatic it is. And so as a result of the fact that we have a system of government that is essentially not really being applied, some of it's being applied, but many of the aspects are not being applied, we're completely left to the devices of our elites. The elites are completely left to govern in any way they see fit. They make up the rules as they go along. And that's a terrible thing for us, particularly in Iraq, because our elites happen to be particularly bad. So I don't have a particularly positive view about elites anywhere in the world, but in Iraq I have a very negative view of them, based on what I consider to be a very negative track record over the past few years. So that's the summary that I make, and I end the book by proposing some type of program for reform that possibly could make a contribution for the future. Now, in relation to what my two colleagues on the panel have said, I'll try to address some of the points that they've made very, very briefly, because I'm conscious of time. The first thing, the main thing that I think, based on Haider's presentation, is I don't think that there's a huge difference between our two discourses. I've read your book, and I think it's a very convincing argument, and I think it's an excellent contribution I think everyone should read. But in terms of the way forward, right, that's one of the points that you ended on. I don't actually suggest a complete reformulation of the constitutional framework, and the reason why I don't is because I don't really think it's achievable. Right? I don't think it's achievable. Maybe in an ideal world, perhaps maybe it would be better. I don't know, but I don't think in the current context it's achievable. So I consider, maybe this is a matter of opinion, but I consider that some of the things that I propose at the end of the book are somewhat modest, I think, in comparison to what perhaps could be achieved. But I think that the type of change that I'm suggesting, I think, can only be achieved incrementally. And I think it can only be achieved despite the political elites. So it would be against their wishes. But I think that partially, I don't want to sound too optimistic, but it can be achieved as a result of powerful civilian forces in the country, including, amongst other things, the Marja'iyya, so the religious institutions in Najaf, who often have the best interests when they speak on many issues. They often speak on the basis of what's the best for the people. And for example, improvements to the electoral law in 2010, moving from a closed system to an open system, were only brought about as a result of the insistence of the religious institutions in Najaf. That's the only reason why. Many people wrongly take credit in the United Nations. They wrongly take credit for the contributions that they made, advice that they may have given to the Iraqis about moving to an open system and so on and so forth. But the only reason why it really happened was because Ayatollah Ali Sistani's representative insisted that it should. And that type of contribution can be used to build upon more developments, or more positive developments. I think that what needs to happen, in my view, over the next few years, is that we need to build a coalition of forces in the country that will present a more comprehensive program that people like Ayatollah Ali Sistani, amongst many others, will sign off on, and will try to impose in some form or another on the political elites. And even if only some of it is implemented, then that would already be a significant amount of progress, I would think. So that's at least in terms of our general perspectives. In relation to some of the detail of what it is that you said, on the perspective on Islam and the role of Islam and so on and so forth, obviously there's a difference between the way in which the Sunni and the Shia consider how they consider Islam should play a role within the state. But I would say that, once again, I don't think that there's a huge difference between them, because I think that fundamentally, I'm not a very religious person, but many Iraqis are. They do consider that religion should play an important role in guiding legislation and guiding government. But I don't think that there's much disagreement that the constitution should necessarily be changed in relation to that specific aspect. No one wants to move to a more Iranian model or even any other type of model. I think people are more or less satisfied with what the constitution says currently. I think that the main difference exists just on the source of inspiration, where people get inspiration from, and that I think even changes at an individual level. It's not just in terms of denomination. Even within the Shia house, many people have different ideas about where they should get their source of inspiration from. And then on the issue of elites and whether or not, if we had different elites, whether or not that would have made any difference in relation to the Constitution and language on federalism and that type of thing, what I would say is that in relation to the Constitution in 2005, if we take it as a given that we had to draft a Constitution in 2005, then within that context, if we had different elites, it may not have made much of a difference in relation to federalism. But what I would suggest at the same time is that there could have been a huge amount of difference in relation to other areas, right? So the provisions, for example, on the security sector, I find to be very deficient in the Constitution, and there's no reason that had to be the case. I find the provisions on judicial independence to be also very deficient, and there's also, once again, no reason why that had to be the case. I find the provisions on independent agencies and corruption and fundamental rights, I also find them to be very, very wanting, and there isn't any reason why it had to be that way. On federalism, you can argue that it had to be that way because there were competing visions, and therefore we had to have this loose language that would allow for these competing competing visions to exist within a broader constitutional framework, that may absolutely be right. But however, these other issues, there weren't differing opinions about them. It just wasn't taken seriously. It wasn't taken seriously, and that's a major problem. In relation to some of the important questions that Andrew put, I don't know how much time I have left, but I'll try to make progress. Was it an inevitably dark outcome as a result of the context in which we were working, namely a foreign military occupation? And I would say yes, perhaps, maybe. Okay, and I would say that the reason why is because when I criticize the elites in Iraq, I'm not criticizing all elites. What I'm criticizing is the particular elites who are in government. And the reason why I say that is because, my view of the occupation is a negative one. I wasn't particularly happy about it. I wasn't a fan at all of the previous regime, and my family suffered terribly as a result of it. But I also wasn't very happy about the fact that the country was occupied militarily. And many people, like me, amongst many others, were approached by occupation forces and offered, positions, and would you be happy to contribute, and so on and so forth. And many people like me turned down that possibility. We weren't happy to even consider it. And the reason why is because I would not be seen as a collaborator. I did not want to collaborate in that context. Okay, so for me, from 2003. Those early years of occupation, afterwards obviously it changed, but those early years of occupation, it was a very, very difficult decision to make, to decide whether or not to collaborate in the context of a foreign military occupation. Some people decided to do so because they thought, let's make the best of a bad situation. But many people decided to do so because they thought this is a great opportunity to make a lot of cash, to be very powerful in a country, to become very wealthy, powerful, et cetera, et cetera. It attracted a lot of the wrong people for the wrong reasons, because it required a certain degree of moral compromise. Because a U.S. occupation in Iraq isn't like the U.S. occupation in Germany or whatever. It comes with a huge amount of baggage, right, of past experience in Iraq and so on and so forth, of bombing campaigns and sanctions and so on and so forth, and a dishonest motive for going to war in the first place in 2003, which was weapons of mass destruction. And within that context, I think it would have been very difficult to achieve a positive outcome because from the start, there was an elimination process of who would be in government and who would not be. And that was, on many occasions, it was a decision that was self-imposed by Iraqis. On some occasions, it was the occupation forces who weren't interested in working with certain people. But as soon as that elimination process started, you were left with, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, a lot of people who were representing negative elements. And I mean, obviously, my friend Ranj is here from the United Kingdom. What he would say is that doesn't apply to all political parties, and that the Kurdish parties fall under a different category. And I would agree with that. Okay, so I'll save you the trouble of making that point afterwards. Okay. In relation to the constitutional process, I think this is the last point that I'll be able to address before I wrap up. In relation to the constitutional process. And whether or not it could have led to, there could have been a different result or a better result at the time. Once again, I would say probably not, for the reasons, first of all, that I just mentioned. I don't think we would have been able to achieve a better result because the actors were who they were, but also because, and this is another very important element, because the conditions within which we were drafting our constitution were imposed by a foreign actor. And the foreign actor was acting on the basis of many interests, right? Some of which had nothing to do with our own national interests, right? So timetables and so on and so forth. Many people have been confused for many years why it had to be the case that the constitutional process had to take place within 6 months and why it could not be extended by a further 6 months as provided for by the interim constitution, by the TAL. Many people in Iraq at the time were asking for an additional 6 months to improve the constitutional text, and that was completely rejected by many people, amongst others by the U.S. authorities at the time. And as soon as you have a foreign power that's determining the conditions within which you're drafting your constitution, and as soon as the foreign power is doing so on the basis of its own interests, at least for the most part, right? And I think that's inevitable in any event, right? As soon as the foreign power is there, obviously they're going to be working on the basis of their own interests. Then that puts you in a very, very difficult position, and I don't think it's necessarily very, very easy to achieve a positive result in that situation. So I think I'm going to stop now. I'll try to address some of the other points during the discussion.
Great. So here's what I'm going to suggest, because Andrew was so great about posing questions, not just to Zaid, but to Haider.
Right.
I thought it'd be great to get Haider in and begin a conversation up here.
Okay.
And then we'll draw in folks from the audience. So, Haider, you want to maybe come in now?
Sure, no, and I appreciate the questions. I think they were very good ones. Let me start with actually the federalism question, because it sort of wraps in something that Zaid said, as well as a couple of questions of of Andrew's. There's no doubt that there's some level of luck that was involved in federalism. That is to say that if the Shia had actually followed, the Shia populace had actually adhered to some of the ideas that Skiri and now Iski was advocating in terms of this grand Shia super region that was going to have as much autonomy out of Iraq as, and had they been as disillusioned with the idea of the Iraqi nation state as the Kurds, we would have had trouble much earlier. Of course, I think we would have had trouble much before a constitutional process even began in that case, because the Shia, if the Shia were as disillusioned with the Iraqi state as the Kurds were, regarded as basically a genocidal catastrophe, I wonder if the state could have survived. But at the same time, by delaying the process and by forcing it into legislation, and I think that was the point of the phone call, by forcing it into legislation, sure, the Shia political parties, and Iski in particular, thought, well, we're not going to do anything. It's just a simple majority. We just pass it and then we're done. The advantage of legislative sessions is they are open. So you have these great opportunities for people like Zaid to sit there and quote at length these very embarrassing sessions in which some of these discussions take place. I have a few of them as well, although they're sort of separate. And I do think that sort of at least forced Iski's hand, because it sort of opened the box, because all of a sudden the Sadrists, who during the negotiations were silent, couldn't sit there silently during a constitutional session on TV, a legislative session on TV with someone saying super region. They had to stand up there and say, we don't even believe in the super region, and attribute it to the occupation and as part of some creating this unity thing. But one thing I will say is that I do think that capaciousness helps in other contexts with respect to federalism. One of them is with respect to the province. Zaid pointed out when he spoke, and he said, well, Diyala is now asking for regional autonomy.
I don't know if it still is.
That's right. But what's interesting about that, of course, is that request, to the extent that it exists, is very different than the Kurdish request. That is to say that they don't regard themselves as separate people. They're just fed up with the government. In fact, I think when Diyala did it, or it might have been Salahuddin, I don't remember which one of them it was either you deliver us these goods within the next 3 months, or we're going to seek independence. That's obviously not the Kurdish position, right? We'll be different people if you give us some stuff. In fact, that would be offensive to most nationalists. So the capaciousness in some ways with respect to regionalism, I think, does benefit, because one doesn't really know how these things are going to turn out. Diyala and Salahuddin being a particularly good example, because the Sunnis walked out of the constitutional process because of federalism, and then all of a sudden they were the ones arguing for it, and the Shia were the ones saying no. So I do think that capaciousness, given the unpredictability of events, did help, but there's no doubt that some luck helped as well. That brings me to a sort of a separate point that Andrew raised, which is, well, does process matter at all then? Are we just sort of going to can we dismiss it entirely? And I don't think we can. I don't mean to take that radical of a position. While I do think that constitutions that have been castigated as terrible, in Egypt 1923 is probably a good example of this, where Zaid Al-Ali gets up there and says, this is a horrible constitution, I absolutely despise it. And now within Egyptian political culture, that constitution is actually respected and not really considered sort of imposed by an occupier. People can change. But at the same time, a process, there's no doubt that you have an opportunity during a process to be inclusive, to have an opportunity to bring people together, and that opportunity was squandered. I don't disagree with Zaid, by the way, that the rushed process led to some sloppy drafting in other areas. That obviously wasn't my major focus. My major focus was on incrementalism with respect to these deeply divisive issues. But obviously I don't doubt that. Andrew raised another question that I really did want to address, and that had to do with whether or not the failure of the authoritarianism has something to do with the failure of the constitutional process. And I don't think so. And the reason is because, irrespective of the gaps respecting security, and I take the point, the Constitution actually doesn't give the Prime Minister. What it does is give the Council of Ministers some level of power, but it also gives to the Parliament the ability to dissolve, and this was insisted on because of the fear of a dictator, to dissolve the government on a vote of no confidence, which parliamentary systems do. What it doesn't have, which most parliamentary systems do, is the power of the Prime Minister to call for new elections, to effectively dissolve the Parliament, right? That normally had Tony Blair says, that's it, we're going to have an election. It's not Blair, I'm out of date. Anyway, you get the point. Cameron can call for new elections. elections. And I think a lot of this was tried, there was some sort of attempt to sort of weaken an authoritarian state. But I do think that there's some level of authoritarian mentality and some level of sort of political culture that isn't so much elites as sort of remnants of Saddam. And I don't think Zaid's book necessarily disagrees with that. The forced confessions are probably very good. The reliance on confessions, there aren't that many judges who are exiles. In fact, I don't know of any. But certainly you do have problems of this is how that's always been done. You beat the guy up until he confesses, and that's pretty much, you pick up the guy that you think that you want, you beat up the guy, and that's it. The last point I did want to address, and I will then turn it over, had to do with Egypt, and I should address it because I, in the beginning of my book, pointed out that Andrew's prediction of Iraq was wrong, and then I wrote a conclusion about Egypt that then turned out after I published the book to be wrong. So God is just.
And I'm here as
It's true that I thought that the capacious Constitution of Egypt was probably a step in the right direction when the Brotherhood drafted it. One thing I do want to emphasize is that, to me, the capacious Constitution isn't enough. That what you need is an incremental constitution-making process where one drafts capacious text in which understandings can be built, and then the different factions work together in order to solve problems, sort of one by one, step by step, incrementally, rather than having everything trying to be dealt with in some massive session in which the future of the nation is at stake. And I think the Brotherhood did a pretty decent job of capacious constitution making, but a really bad job at the second part of that. It did seem as if their processes were very secretive, were very non-inclusive, and they were, in the way that Zaid correctly characterizes the Iraqi exile parties, that they were used to having to operate through cells and secrecy, and this is just what they got used to, and this is how they tended to operate, and so they had a much harder time, I think, in open legislative process. And that I would probably ascribe that to the failure of Egypt more than the text of the Constitution itself.
Okay. So Andrew, do you want to offer some reactions?
Well, just something pretty simple, because from beginning at least, I maintained that the chance is not going to be big that the constitution-making process can really accomplish what its supposed goal was, namely some kind of constitutional democracy is the outcome. But I thought it gave the country a chance. I also thought that some of the frame of the process wasn't bad. It wasn't so much imitating the two-stage thing elsewhere as a kind of thing that developed out of the conflict of different proposals between the Americans, between the Najaf clergy. But in any case, the overall structure of this was good, in the sense that an interim constitution has some really important functions for allowing the actors to even if you want, incrementally, to get into a position where they actually can treat each other as, if not exactly friends, at least opponents rather than enemies.
Or common participants.
Common participants in a project.
Right, yeah.
And I thought that there were some very specific reasons why the project didn't work, but I would like to disagree in part with Zaid that you cannot put all of that on the Americans. I think the Americans really were responsible for constructing a governing council at the beginning that was exclusionary. I mean, we know that the Mayo has tried to expand it. The Sadrists were not there, Sunni nationalists were not there. The Sunni representatives there didn't represent anybody important, although it turned out that the Iraqi Islamic Party did become important later, but probably because they were there to begin with. So that part is certainly the Americans. And the timetable that I think you stressed, which is extremely important, I mean, you compare it with South Africa, and you do in your book, is very important comparison. One need not take 6 years or 7, but I think 2 or 3 would be a lot better than this artificially shortened timetable. That was geared to the American elections. So I think it was clear that there's an American role. But, and here's where I disagree. The Sunni inclusion was in fact stimulated by the Americans. So it doesn't follow, and of course we know this from Japan, that everything an occupying power does is necessarily wrong. And in this particular case, that was an extremely important step, because that was, in a sense, fueling the insurrection. That was also unjust. And they did it, right? I mean, under pressure, Condoleezza Rice first. It was never Bremer because he didn't understand anything. But I think the people in Washington did understand something. Now, why were they excluded? I think they were excluded on the basis of this Kurdish Shiite bargain, that we're not going to let, these people can be there as window dressing, will please the Americans. We're not really going to let them. I mean, I think the renegotiation of debatification would be a minimum to keep them there. I think one of you stresses that in the book, I think both of you. You know, it's not the Americans who, yeah, maybe Bremer insisted on debatification. That was not Khalilzad's perspective. He didn't care about that. So I think some of this was self-caused. Now, what would have happened if they actually made a deal? And one more point is that I think we can, the two of you can rightly disagree, and you have to decide among yourselves how deep the divisions of Iraqi society and who's responsible for it. I'm really not competent to decide it. But I think lots of issues that you, Haider, mentioned are eminently negotiable. Not, you know, perhaps the ultimate structure of the state, who the demos is, I know Sujit has written about that. That choice is ultimately a question of either or, perhaps. But a lot of the subsidiary questions are, in fact, negotiable. One can, you know, we, four of us could actually make proposals about how one could bring together elements of consensus and a majoritarian rule. And these things are not, by their nature, impossible to compromise and negotiate. And I think to some extent it was this deal between Skiri, I would say, above all Skiri, because you can't say it's a Shiite view as such, but Skiri, the Supreme Council of Islamic Revolution, and the Kurdish deal, which really sort of presupposed that it was not going to happen, although on lots of issues it could have happened.
So, Zaid, you know, I'd like to get some of our kind of audience in to answer. So would it be okay if we kind of began some questions, and then there'll be a chance for you to respond to Andrew. Are there any questions from the floor? Julian.
Thanks. So just two questions. I guess they're for Hamoudi, but in light of what Zaid said. So the first is that given Zaid's really strong arguments about the context of Iraq and the difficulties, the possible inevitabilities of these negative consequences given the elites involved, do you really want to say that the capaciousness was a success and is a success, or is it more something that's just a success for now? This might be a sort of obvious question, but I'm just very curious what your answer is, because, you know, capaciousness obviously can lead to incrementalism, which is great. I'm all for good informal change, but capaciousness can also, like, equally obviously lead to authoritarianism and authoritarian majoritarianism. So I'm just curious where you stand on the essential qualities of capacious constitution making. The second point is related. After Egypt, do you still view capaciousness as a model? Or is its success in Iraq more of a happy accident?
Right. So let me be clear on one thing, which may not have come across in my remarks, but I hope does in my book. I certainly don't think of capaciousness as some sort of ideal model by any means. If you can agree, as, say, the American political, consensus has tended to, although there are trends against that, that the state shouldn't be guided by a particular set of religious principles. You should write it down. I mean, it's much better to do that. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some level of disagreement about what that means, free exercise and establishment. But to the extent that you can come to agreement, I think you should. I mean, the real question that I think one is faced with in some of these questions is, if you have groups that are absolutely insistent on particular formulations of how the state should work, respecting federalism or respecting Islam, right? And you have secular groups who say, look, we will not accept, we do not want any role for religion in the state. And someone else who says, and I agree, nobody wanted an Iranian model, but we want an important role for religion in the state. What are you going to say? And you have to say something. And I think that you're sort of forced into capaciousness. I obviously, ideally, specificity is better. But if in order to create a constitution to which both parties can adhere, we can have some level of capaciousness, and then we can build institutions that can negotiate this divide, it seems to me that that's a better way to go about things than not. Yes, obviously, the problems can result. But it seems to me that the division over something like federalism in Spain, for example, is as serious now as it was in the Civil War, or maybe not as serious, but is very serious now as it was during the Civil War, but they're not shooting each other, so that's kind of good. So it does seem to me that it's an imperfect solution, but it's a form of solution. Can I just say one other thing, which sort of relates to something that you were describing, and it does relate to Iraq's pathological state, and that is to say that I'm not sure South Africa is a great model, because I do think that there's a difference, both South Africa and Eastern Europe, where a group basically says, okay, that's it, it's up. We're going to negotiate the terms of our political surrender, maybe by retaining important economic rights, right? In other words, we want to try to retain our wealth and whatnot. But we're basically negotiating a political surrender and political marginalization. I just don't think that that's the way it happened in Iraq, obviously. And so I think a multi-year process might not necessarily have led to a different result. I'm not suggesting that, they should have done even faster or they should have done as fast as they did. But I do think that there are some important differences that have to be borne in mind as well that I think complicated negotiations, the insecurity of the Shia, the uncertainty of the Shia about the future, their insistence, absolute insistence on a majoritarianism that was really, really uncompromising. I mean, all of these things, I think, were more complicating, I think, than existed elsewhere, and were potentially destabilizing unless you got to a foundational document in relatively short order, but not.
You want to offer a comment? Sure.
Two brief comments.
Sure, of course.
So I would just go a little bit further than that. I don't disagree with anything, but I would go a little bit further. And I would say that capaciousness or flexibility, flexible constitutional language, I think is great in relation to some things. I think it's important and it's a useful tool. But I would say that in our societies, in the Arab region, in the Middle East, and possibly outside as well, I don't know the rest of the world as well as I do the Middle East, but I would say that really precise language in constitutional documents is very, very important for us. And the reason why is because our societies or our states and our histories are very different to what exists in Europe and what exists in North America and so on and so forth. Flexibility in the United States Constitution is good because it allows for institutions to adapt according to circumstances, et cetera, and depending on what happens in a particular context, maybe the court can favor this type of idea or that type of idea because the language of the Constitution allows you to, and the democratic traditions fill that void, or they use the flexible language to make it come to life, right? In our societies, that just doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work at all, and the reason why is because we've been led by dictatorship for a very long time. The types of democratic traditions that exist here and in other places aren't as rooted as in Iraq. I mean, that's fairly obvious, right? So, we have a lot of foreigners and Americans, whatever, all over the Middle East who say you have to have a flexible constitution. I'm not suggesting that that's what you're saying, by the way. Say you have to have a flexible constitution. In Libya, lots of people say that, right? And I think that's extremely dangerous, right? Because, we need precise rules. We need precise rules to tell the politicians how they should behave in relation to all sorts of very, very important issues, right? And where there can be very precise language, then there should be. Where it's not possible, then we should try to find, some type of compromise that would allow things for things to progress, and we can worry about those issues perhaps later down the line. The other very brief issue that I want to mention as well is...
Zaid, can I comment on that, actually?
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, so this, you're kind of rushing to agree with each other, and I want to create let's have a bit of a fight, okay? So let's have a bit of division. So
but I have to respond to the other point as well. Right?
You will, I promise, okay? Let's defer that issue, okay? So Haider kind of advocates capaciousness. You
Yes.
want specificity. Let's give us an example.
Yes, okay.
Or you guys disagree.
Okay,
And then we can, at least let's kind of work this out, okay?
Okay.
So,
well, I don't know if this is an area where we'll disagree or not, but I mean, this is an example that I talk about a lot, and it's become very, very serious in Iraq, is that there's a specific provision in the Constitution about the security sector. What it says is, the language in the Constitution is, the Prime Minister is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. That's all it says. It's like one sentence and the next clause, right? That, I don't know whose idea it was to put that provision in the Constitution, but it turns out to be extremely problematic, right? And the reason why is because one day our Prime Minister picked up the Constitution and he's looking through the text, right, saying, what can I use to dominate the state? And oh, look at this. Oh, it says I'm the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. And guess what? It doesn't say anything about what that means, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an office, which I'm going to call the Office of the Commander-in-Chief, right? And I'm going to get all the officers' numbers in the military. I'm going to call them on their cell phones and tell them what to do. And if anyone objects, I'll tell them, but I'm the Commander-in-Chief. I can do whatever I want, right? This is the military, and I control the military, right? So obviously a constitution can't provide full protection against anything. If there's going to be abuse, then there will be abuse and so on and so forth. But a constitution can help. It can make things more difficult, right? And more protection, more guidance against that type of thing, would have been very, very helpful in the Constitution to try to prevent the types of abuses that are taking place at the moment.
Okay, so now I want Haider to come in on this, and then Zaid, you'll get to respond, then I want to go back to the floor, okay?
Yeah, except that unfortunately, I don't disagree on that point. I'm wondering
Okay.
if maybe the court is a better example, because Andrew
Right.
had raised it, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that's a good example or not. I mean, for all I know, Zaid's going to agree with me in return. But I think the court is probably a very good point on which Shia-Sunni differences actually do matter. That is to say, it was very important for the Shia, if the court is going to actually strike down legislation that is violative of Islam, for the most part, the consensus that has developed within the Sunni world has been that you just sort of empower judges to do that. They're state law judges, and they do that. That's actually, for a secularist, they'd rather have none of this, but if they're going to have it, at least have a state law judge who knows civil law and is sort of familiar with secular law, and have that person, I'm going to say that guy because it's all men. It's not a very inclusive process on that point. I agree with Zaid again. But for the Shia, this whole idea was quite offensive, and I think that they warranted clerics on there, and I think that was violative of a core nationalist notion among Sunnis. What do you mean a cleric? Some Najaf cleric whose hermeneutical methods and whose epistemological assumptions border somewhere between the bizarre and the ridiculous, in his opinion, is going to secularist. Doesn't even need to be a Sunni. Is going to sit on a court and start to make decisions. And I think that these sorts of very, very severe divisions, and I'm not sure it's that easy to paper over, caused a capacious text. And what ended up happening was you had a de facto court continue. I take Andrew's point that perhaps that makes the court weaker than it would have been otherwise, but I don't see what the alternative is. Sort of keep in an institution, call it caretaker, and move your way forward in the same way that the India model is certainly the one I'm thinking about with the personal law. And so that might be an example in which I think capaciousness actually served the state well, notwithstanding some of the criticisms.
Zaid, so now, Andrew, do you want to jump in on just on this?
Just on this.
Okay.
I mean, it's extremely interesting, this particular capaciousness, on which I was wrong, and he points it out kindly, both in an article and in the book. But it's very interesting what makes the thing capacious in this case. So the clause of the new constitution says there will be a certain number of Shia judges or Sharia experts, and also secular judges. But it doesn't decide how this will be done or the number, because it will require a two-thirds law of the subsequent parliament to actually accomplish it.
It hasn't been done.
That doesn't seem very capacious so far. Now, the capaciousness has to do with the fact that there's Article 130, which says that all laws of the previous regime until replaced continue. And one of the laws of the regime established the nature of the Supreme Court, which was pointed very late in the life of the interim constitution. So on that basis, the court remains. Now, that's where I went wrong, because I thought that the life of the law is logic rather than sociology or politics. I turned out to be wrong about that. So the court stays. But I mean, this is not a capacious as anyone intended. I'm sure that some of their lawyers figured out later that we can actually not dissolve this thing on the basis of 130. I doubt that anybody planned it this way, because it's almost impossible, even for the legal mind, to invent this particular constellation of things. One more just very brief point, but it's not going to be, I won't go into the details. In a very interesting part of the text, Haider points to 4 different ways of being capacious. One is to have principles which will be interpreted in subsequent. I mean, of course, all constitutions must have that. Then he says ambiguities, which you just discussed. Your example, Zaid's example, points to an ambiguity. Then you say contradictions. I'm not so sure how productive contradictions can be. But the thing I'm most concerned about is the delay, which, by the way, is the part which most resembles Lerner's idea of Israeli constitution making. The way that the Harare resolution worked, and subsequent, basically, majoritarian decisions about the whole basic law. Delayed to me, maybe I'm too American and not sufficiently British, but to me the idea that you, instead of creating this entrenched documents with its protections and with its enforcement mechanisms, and put in certain places of it pure majoritarian rule. In fact, in the case of some of the issues, even without a veto, To me, that's, of course, capaciousness can violate constitutionalism, but this, I think, is a violation of it.
Okay, Zaid, you've been
Sorry.
Yes.
The other
No,
point,
it's fine.
the other point that I wanted to make, and this is actually a point where I disagree with Haider, and I think this is a sharp disagreement as well, is whether or not a multi-year process would have made a difference. Now, the reason why I really do think it would make a difference is because it's easy for a lot of us to forget, and I'm not suggesting that this is something that Haider's forgotten, that in 2005 the context was very violent in Iraq, and it was increasingly violent and getting more and more violent, and it got more violent over the coming years, right? And in a state of violence, when you're negotiating a fundamental text in that type of context, priorities change. They're not the same types of priorities that you have in a stable, secure, safe environment where you can talk about things in a calmer environment. In an insecure environment where one of increasing violence, your priorities tend to become one of primordial instincts of survival, et cetera, one of protection from the other, et cetera. And at the time, that's why the call for the mega region in the south of the country, some people listened to that and they thought it made a lot of sense at the time in 2005. We need to be protected from these other people, right, who are attacking us, that type of thing. But when things calmed down in Iraq in 2008, right, and violence was under control and people started focusing on other issues, right, then all of a sudden discourse changed very suddenly. People started talking about governance, they talked about human rights, they talked about fundamental rights, political rights, about corruption, et cetera, right? If the Constitution had been drafted in that type of context, we would have a very different text, I'm sure. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
So can I disagree with both of them? Or
Look, how about that? I want to get Jean Cohen in because she's been waiting for about 10 minutes,
Sure.
and then we can come back. Okay, so Jean, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, not just me, I mean, the way some of it was addressed, because, I mean, I'm not a rock expert, I didn't read these books, because of course, they just come out. But I was trying to think through, maybe I already answered this, but I was trying to think through what the difference is between this word capaciousness and, non-capacious.
Right.
Because obviously, it can't, it can't mean that, all constitutional principles are pretty vague. Equality.
Well, they're abstract.
Right.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. I mean,
Yeah.
you can interpret, yes, the concept of equality is interpreted to permit segregation, to not permit it. I mean, they're pretty open, but, okay, so that's one point. Not vague, but they're abstract, fine. Capacious, whatever. So that's the first point. The second, so then the question is, I mean, all constitutions have some of them have very specific things in them, but I guess, I don't know if you meant by capacious, not deciding something or leaving, I mean, for Arnold Lerner, the idea was you don't make the Constitution, you wait, or you leave some highly contentious things left open. The few things that I know about, very little, probably will disagree, but I mean, I'm not too thrilled with what was left open, and I know why it was so, but nevertheless, what was left open in India, for example, the no uniform civil code, I think this has led to disasters. Now, I understand why, but it doesn't make sense. So, in a sense, I would think that if you can get the good stuff in terms of principles that are pretty abstract, if you have a chance to do that, you do it. You might have to compromise. There's some compromises in the American Constitution which some of us are not so happy about, but there were compromises. And I think every society probably is equally divided. Certainly the American one was. They ended up fighting a war over it. So I'm not sure what the advantages are, or how you would distinguish between a longer-term, multi-stage constitution-making process and this capaciousness where you just don't address, or you leave it to some other time later on, where you don't know what the constellation will be. It could be worse, not better, by the way. And why is that? It could be much worse. And if you don't put the things in that you think you should have when you can, you might never get it. So I don't see what the strong argument is for capaciousness in that sense.
Okay, so I think that's the whole panel. So why don't we start? Haider, you want to start, and then we'll move over?
Sure. I would say that okay, so first of all, let me say, and I hope I said this in the book, and again, it might not have come across in my remarks. I agree that principles in almost any constitution are of some level of abstraction. But I am talking about delaying things. Let's leave aside the specific case of India, although Iraq does something extremely similar to India, although in reverse. In other words, we have a uniform civil code, and what the Islamic parties wanted to do was to repeal the Uniform Civil Code, and said it's repealed and Iraqis are free according to their conscience and personal status, and this is going to be organized in law. The Supreme Court has taken the position, which actually I don't think is unreasonable. I mean, we can be critical of the court, that requires legislation, and the parties are bitterly divided, and they have been for some period of time. What is the advantage of that? Well, why not just sort of make it a multi-stage process? Well, it does seem to me that the Constitution serves a role in acting as a document of national identity. It also seems to me that there are some levels of specificity in the Constitution that are followed that are important in terms of preserving the democratic order of the state. For example, the legislative sessions. The legislature in its first session, I think in 2010, at some point in 2009, some legislators got it in their head. That's one of those where I wanted to write the whole thing down, and the editor made me cut it. Of legislators basically saying, well, we haven't really done our entire legislative program, so let's extend it by a couple of years. The fact that the Constitution doesn't let you do that was an important role, I think, in doing that. So you have some level of specificity over important things that help preserve the democratic order of the state. You also have, to use Sanford Levinson's sort of idea of constitutional faith, you have some level of identity that gets invested in the document. And you get that without having to decide questions that are very difficult to decide. The point I kind of wanted to make in response to Zaid's about the multi-year process, it does seem to me that Zaid is a lot frustrated with the elites, and I can't disagree with that. But at the same time, if it was a multi-year process and it was participatory, in other words, it involved large numbers of the public, the opportunity for demagoguery, which we already see in cases like de-Baathification, and Farsi is going to become the next language on one side and on the other, would be that much amplified, right? I mean, every time that some story got leaked out, oh, they're making Farsi the official language of Iraq, which is ridiculous, or, oh, the Baathists are coming back, we have to sort of ban them, or they're going to make the Baath party legal, or whatever. That it could have been damaging. In other words, to have a longer process. I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily the case, but I would say that there are costs as well as benefits to a longer process.
So just in relation to abstraction in constitutions, obviously lots of principles are abstract, but there's a different tradition that's emerging in developing nations. It's very different to the Western tradition, and it's linked to what it was I was saying earlier, which is that in our societies, the type of constitutional framework that exists in Western societies just doesn't work. It just doesn't work in our societies, right? The idea of just you organize elections and democratic institutions fill the void, and they start working and they apply vague principles, whatever. That hasn't really worked out in our favor at all in the Arab region or beyond. And the different tradition is that now, based on that experience, lots of countries are emerging now and are trying to develop different constitutional frameworks, which are becoming much more detailed than what exists in Europe and North America. And if you look at provisions on freedom of expression in North America, the provisions are very, very, very brief, and it may come across as being abstract. But in many developing nations now, the provisions tend to be a lot more detailed, right? And there's a lot more meat to them. And they still remain abstract in that context, but a lot less so. And that's because of our different traditions, and we're trying to. It may not work. Maybe this current path isn't going to lead us in the right direction. But there's an attempt to try to develop something that's different in order to resolve our particular problems, right? And the other thing is that in relation to capaciousness and whether or not it's useful and so on and so forth, or whether it's actually desirable, what I would just say in response to that is that we had a dynamic that was imposed upon us by an invasion and so on and so forth, right? And also the interim constitution that had this framework for drafting a constitution. So if within that dynamic, that was basically imposed upon us by military occupation and other forces as well, within that dynamic, you consider that there's value in completing the Constitution, right, within that context. And if you consider that there's value in doing so within a short time frame, then there was no other way to do it, right? So within that context, it makes sense, right? But what I challenge is that context didn't have to exist. There were other options that were available, and I don't think.
Where you're saying opposite things.
Excuse me, sorry.
You are where you're saying opposite things.
Between what and what? Sorry. Between the two of us? Yeah, we don't agree on everything. Yeah, sure. No, we're not twin brothers.
Well, that's a relief. Okay, let's go. So I have, yeah, I guess I have a comment and a question. So the comment is, to some extent, the need for issue deferral. Andrew and I talked about this in the panel, last year. The increasing frequency of it might be a function of the increasing scope of constitutional negotiations, right? So if you look at the Federalist Constitution, look at the South African Constitution. I mean, what's striking is not just the modern orientation and language of the South African Constitution, but its scope and mandate. And so what is the agenda of a constitutional negotiating process is this dramatically, it's been dramatically expanded over the last 2 centuries. And so it's impossible to resolve all those issues in a drafting process. And so this idea of kind of having implementation and implementation machinery and mechanisms and oversight procedures built into the very DNA of a 21st century constitution is just the way it is now, right? And so, given that exists, issues get parked or deferred because they in that implementation kind of process or infrastructure, because it's there and it helps to lubricate agreement. It helps to enable people to move forward. So I just think so the question is not deferral or not deferral, but it's how. Through what means, when, and what issues get deferred, and what issues get deferred, what don't. That to me is the modern debate, and I think we have a lot of thinking to do to kind of organize the different mechanisms or instrumentalities of deferral, and then to begin to think about what issues they're appropriate for and what they're not. So what questions of structure can or can't be deferred, rights can or can't be deferred, fourth branch, and so forth. So that's the way I think it would go. So then I think, so that leads to my question, which is what type of regional example or lesson can we draw from Iraq, right? So Zaid directs the constitution building program at IDEA based in Cairo. His programs extend from Morocco to Yemen. And so there's a lot of comparative examples, experiences that are kind of at the core of these constitution building processes across the region. And so I'm curious as to what role Iraq plays in these discussions, positive or negative. So that, given that, in a sense, before the Arab Spring, it was the most visible and public process of Arab constitutional politics in the last half century. And so in Arabic, and so all the material is available in Arabic. All the debates were in Arabic. So how does Iraq loom in the processes that are occurring right now across the whole region? So that, positively or negatively, how should it loom? So that's a question first to Zaid and then to the panel generally.
Okay, so that's a question that I'm well placed to answer because so I'm based in Cairo, and I work in lots of Arabic and Arab countries. I do a lot of work in Libya, and I do a lot of work in Tunisia as well, and I follow all the other processes as well. And I'm fairly well connected with with constitutional experts in the region. We've got networks now, and so on and so forth, right? And what I can say, like the short answer to that question, is that my work is made more difficult by the fact that I'm Iraqi, because a lot of people just get suspicious. They say, whatever you do, don't try to turn us into Iraq, right? Okay, so, and that's a problem, because it's too bad that I get that type of reaction, but I do, right? Around 1 year ago, Kanaan Makiya, who may be known to some of you, is an Iraqi scholar and well-known individual in Iraq and outside, and wrote a book a long time ago called The Republic of Fear. Last year in the New York Times wrote a piece called, or I don't know if it was called this, but the main angle was that the Arab Spring started in Iraq, he said, right? He's trying to argue that as a result of the inspiration that Arabs felt by looking at Iraq, that was part of the reason why the Arab Spring started. And what I can say in response to that is that in all of my travels all around the Arab region, with the people that I speak to, all my counterparts in parliaments and constituent assemblies and universities and courts and civil society, No one ever talks about how they're inspired by Iraq. No one ever says that. Whenever people find out I'm Iraqi, the first thing they say is, please explain to me why there's so much violence in Iraq. Why is there so much corruption? You know, why are things going so badly? You know, it's never, oh, please tell us about democracy. You know, that's never the reaction I get. And that's, you know, that's too bad, and I'm very sad about it, and I don't like having to defend myself in that type of context. But that's just based on the past 3 years of me being in the Middle East over the past 3 years. It can often be a little bit annoying, particularly when it's stakeholders in the Middle East who try to provoke me, who try to get me to react very, very negatively based on my national affiliation. So, but that's the truth.
Okay. Haider, Andrew, did either of you want to jump in on that?
Yeah.
Or? Yeah.
Well, I completely agree with what you said, and unfortunately, in this case, I predicted something's wrong, but this I actually predicted right. I thought that there are a lot of positive features of the formal process in Iraq, but I thought the fact of the occupation and the outcome are going to compromise it, and that's, I think, a pity. Now, you may not think so, Zaid, but I think it is a pity. Because if you look at something like Egypt, which is the one that I followed most closely, I plan to follow your good work on Tunisia and learn the other case as well. But about Egypt, I can say this, I think, with some certainty, that there was much to learn in Egypt from the Iraqi process. First of all, you include the major forces in negotiations and don't impose. Bremer tried to impose, but to the extent that the process had any success at all, it was because in some ways the Shiite clerics who were tied to Najaf and others made certain kinds of inputs into it. And even the fact that it was negotiated between the Kurds and the Americans, at least in one part of Iraq, made the thing more legitimate. So from this point of view, the Egyptian process could only have benefited from adopting a negotiating meta process, not the ultimate process of a constituent assembly, but the preparatory process, which might create interim constitution. And in fact, in Egypt, they created several interim constitutions, but each one of them is a military imposition. I think it would have been much better in those cases had those been negotiated. And I think although negotiations cannot be all-inclusive because it's impossible in a complex society to even know who they are, who should be there, plurality is much better than one or two. And I think this could have been learned, but I completely agree with you, although I don't know the situation so closely as you do, that Iraq unfortunately disqualified even the positive features of its own model.
Haider, you want to?
Just really quickly, I mean, I mean, I'm sure that in Egypt and Tunisia and everywhere, they wouldn't look at Iraq as a model. There's two problems. One is it was brought about by an American occupation, and two, it resulted in a Shia majority taking control. And in the highly sectarian tensions that would exist, no matter how successful that constitution was, and no matter how successful the state would be, I don't think anybody would be looking to Iraq as a model, because the reality is, and we're seeing this throughout the Arab world, the Islamic world, excuse me, the connection of the citizen to the state is much stronger than we thought it was, and that's what brought about the Arab Spring. It's not 1/10 as strong as the debate over whether Abu Bakr or Ali was the proper deputy to the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, that's definitely going to divide the society. And these broad sectarian divisions are regional, and so the specific example of Iraq, if you go and say Iraq, I don't think would have ever penetrated the consciousness. In fact, even when it was occurring, and at times when Andrew said it had a possibility of success, in his book, you had people from King Hussein to Hosni Mubarak echoing street sentiment with the Shia crescent is coming and Iran is coming and all the rest of it. So, I mean, I do think that there's something there. That's not to. I do think there's a lesson of capaciousness that can be drawn that is useful. That's not to suggest that the specific example of Iraq is one that I would sort of choose to adopt in a Sunni-dominant country, but I do think that there are certain advantages to this. One example, and it sort of responds partly to Andrew's point about contradictory text. If you make the Constitution non-contradictory, in any of these societies, well, Tunisia actually maybe not, but it will be very difficult to get an equal protection clause that says people are equal before the law irrespective of their gender. If you tell them that contradicts with Islam as a source, decide which one's first, Islam's going to come first. The forces are bigger. At the same time, sorry?
Why do you have to
That's what I was saying. You wouldn't tell them, so then you would be left with something that's contradictory, right? I mean, I don't understand how it wouldn't be contradictory. Islam is a source of law. Everybody knows that that refers to family law. Everybody knows that that refers to male polygamy, and it doesn't refer to female polygamy. And at the same time, people are equally irrespective of their gender. I mean, that's the kind of contradiction that I'm talking about. And I think it's better to sort of put that in and let courts and institutions work that out over time. I mean, that's my view of things, and I will admit that, you know, in so doing, I'm looking at models with much stronger institutions. I mean, Zaid's point is well taken, but nonetheless, it seems to me the alternative is women's right, Iraqis are free, are equally irrespective of their gender, subject to Sharia. I mean, that's the choice, right? And I would rather see the contradiction and see this sort of work itself out.
But, you know, it may not even be a contradiction because the Egyptian court, before the overthrow of Mubarak, managed to actually take these things and make sense of them. But it construed Islam too.
Sure.
It construed Islam too. You know, Islam is construable.
Islam is construable, but the Egyptian court didn't deal with polygamy, which is illegal in Egypt. It doesn't deal with the core issues. It deals with sort of the side issues and tries to bring the things closer together.
So I want to collect questions from the floor and then put them back to the panel because we're approaching time. So why don't we just begin? So, yes, sir. Yep.
So I have a quick question. At a moment, Zaid mentioned that one possible source of reform could be from powerful civilian forces that would counterbalance the political elites. And you referred to the role of the Najaf playing in 2010 in pushing from closed list to open list. And thinking of what was happening before the 2010 elections with the broad, civilian mobilization that was non-sectarian, and the potential that that has to put a pressure on the elites, given the fact that we do still have elections. And so I'm thinking, is there instead of thinking of change coming from political reform or constitutional reform, because your book deals with a lot of different disciplines, could not change come from maybe changing the distribution of power in Iraq, maybe, and empowering some social actors that could start pushing for accountability and start removing the debate as it was before 2010 towards a non-sectarian, non-sectarian rhetoric with more performance-based and public service.
George.
An observation and a question. The observation is just in terms of where the Constitution was clear. You already mentioned, say, the issue of regional formation, and another was Kirkuk on the census and the referendum and so on. So it's not, some of the issues have been implementation, not capaciousness, where it was clear, but what was clear has not been implemented. The question is, I'd actually be interested in a comment on sort of government formation after the last election and how all that relates to the elite story.
In 2010?
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go from my right to, I'll go from Andrew to Haider and then give Zaid the last word. And so what I'd ask our panelists to do is kind of react to those questions, offer any concluding remarks.
Right.
And then we'll call it a session. So Andrew, please.
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to respond to something you said.
Okay.
Because it was really interesting, and we have a lot of issues that we share, we consider important. So you said, what is deferred? Issues, what is deferred? And then I would like to add, to whom is one deferring to what you said? Now,
good.
What is deferred, I think, when it comes to ambiguity and even contradictions of the type you just mentioned, I don't have such great problems with. I must say, and maybe, American opinion, at least these days, is becoming more British. Maybe people are not particularly bothered by the fact that a constitution which is supposed to be altered by its amendment rule, which involves qualified majorities in multiple instances, is going to be changed, a constitution is going to be changed and altered and developed through a simple majority subsequently. I mean, I don't know if it really bothers American lawyers. It certainly bothers me because the whole enterprise is purpose, and that's why I think that Lerner is so deeply wrong about Israel. It didn't do Israel a favor to allow, and lots of groups in Israel especially, to actually have a constitution which can be just transformed through simple majorities as the thing goes along. Yeah. And in '48, one could have had a better one. than one could have today also, which is an interesting feature because the whole political framework has so shifted. So the question of what is deferred, I'm willing to accept principles and ambiguities and even some kinds of contradiction, but to defer to majorities, I have continued to have huge problems with. And the second point is to whom? Because we defer to a court ordinarily. I mean, the U.S. court, as everyone knows in law school, right? The U.S. court is actually also forming the Constitution in some ways as it is going along. Right. You defer to a court is one thing. You defer to a legislature which acts by majority is quite another.
Yeah. So, and again, just to offer a quick response,
yes.
I think kind of establishing a taxonomy of mechanisms of deference is the way to kind of have this discussion,
that
right?
Would be good.
That would be good,
That
right?
would be
Because
really
I think that some of those mechanisms aren't purely majoritarian.
Right.
But that's the way to begin that discussion.
Right.
Okay, so Haider.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, one thing I would say is that there's times in which things aren't necessarily divisive and they're deferred. I mean, it's not an American attribute, but certainly it's not unusual for a constitution to say the number of legislators shall be set by law. I mean, it's effectively a deferral, right? I mean, it's effectively leaving for later legislative majorities the opportunity to fill it in. I guess what I would say as an American lawyer is, yeah, it doesn't bother me, I mean, and I don't know if I'm being representative or at least representative of the realists, it doesn't necessarily bother me that constitutions get amended without going through formal legal processes. It just seems to me that long-standing constitutions always do. Conditions change, and one expects a political culture to look at its document in fundamentally different ways. And so this is merely one sort of way in which that is occurring. Obviously, it's not temporal, but it's sort of, well, it is temporal in a sense, but I mean, it's dealing with a division, and it's attempting over some period of time to address a matter of festering dispute. As I said, I'm not suggesting that it would be ideal to do that. I don't necessarily think that it is, but I do think that that at times it's sort of inevitable. One thought, final concluding thought that sort of came with your question, which I thought was a very interesting one. I mean, one of the concerns you have is that while I completely agree with Zaid that there's so much among the elite that's sort of demagoguery, demagoguery sort of relies on some basis. I mean, the Shia obsession, Shia political elite obsession with de-Baathification is a way to marginalize Sunni elites. I mean, that's what happens. Relies on an assumption, just as the Sunni sort of fear of Iran relies on an assumption that the Ba'ath or Iran or whatever are a threat, right? I mean, it doesn't work. McCarthyism doesn't work unless people are scared of communism, right? And so the problem is that while these other institutions sort of might appeal to our better angels, and those exist, the worse angels exist. There is some sentiment within the Sunni community that tends to wonder whether Shia are truly allegiant to Iraq or Iran. There is a significant contingent within the Shia community that worries about Sunnis being closet Baathists. And it's so easy to exploit that. And so I think that that's the problem and the danger going forward.
Zaid, last word to you.
Okay, but I have three last words. Okay. So the first is the question about empowering social actors. I mean, the answer to that is another question, which is how would that happen? What mechanism would you use in order to allow that to happen? You know, there are some social actors which are already empowered in Iraq because of the nature of things, and they'll always be empowered. So, for example, the Marja'iyya in Najaf is empowered, and they'll continue to be for probably forever. You know, but outside of that. You know, when you're trying to get other forces in, how would you empower them? That's extremely difficult in Iraq. First of all, because one mechanism would be perhaps through the media. So, you know, if there was a proper media platform, then perhaps, you know, convincing public intellectuals would have a platform, and they would give them that platform to express ideas or criticisms and so on and so forth. But media is completely controlled by the political parties in Iraq, right? Totally controlled by them. So then what? Then you have elections, maybe, right? So perhaps, you know, some social actors could be empowered through elections, but that's also controlled by the political parties, and they won't allow anyone outside of their circle to break in. And even if someone by mistake manages to break through, right, then that person's immediately marginalized. And there are a couple of examples of that. There's one example in 2009 and another in 2013, like really, really isolated examples. So my question is, you know, I don't know what mechanism, you know, whether or not there's a convincing mechanism to allow for the type of thing that you're talking about to happen. I hope there is one, because I'm going to be trying to do it over the next few years, right? So fingers crossed, you know, if you have any great ideas, please let me know. And in relation to George's question on government formation and how this relates to the issue of elites and so on and so forth. So in 2010, the election results were really spectacular at the time. At the time, people were describing them as being an earthquake. This is earth-shattering. And then at the end, it made absolutely no difference, right? So why is that? How did that happen? You had the State of Law Coalition, which was campaigning on a platform of national unity and some type of constitutional reform, perhaps that type of thing. And Iraqiyya which was kind of campaigning on the same basis. And those two parties managed to get a significant majority together. And there was an anticipation amongst many people that they might form a government. Perhaps with some others as well. But those two would form a core within government, and it never happened. And the reason why it never happened is the same reasons why lots of things never happen in Iraq is short-sightedness, narrow-mindedness, selfishness, incompetence, right? It's remarkable. What they ended up doing is that they negotiated this agreement, which is commonly referred to as the Erbil agreement, right? To form the new government, right? Now, that document, the agreement, was kept secret for months, or more than months, for years, right? And no one really knew why. It was like, why is these are an agreement to form the new government? Why aren't they showing us the document? When eventually it was circulated, we understood why it was being kept secret, because it was so embarrassing, right? It had almost no detail about anything, right? It said, okay, so what is the government going to be doing? What is its platform going to be? What is its program going to be, right? They just included this list of constitutional provisions. Oh, we're going to protect freedom of expression and freedom of association. We're going to pass new laws about the court, whatever. But all that's in the Constitution anyway. That's not a choice. That's supposed to be happening as a matter of course, right? It didn't say anything about the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, about deadlines or whatever. And the deadlines that did exist had language like, and I'm quoting, right? Within a few days, X, Y, Z will happen. I mean, what does that mean? That's not a convincing platform, or a document to form a government, particularly in the circumstances that you're talking about in 2010, It's a real betrayal by the political parties, They made zero effort to negotiate a real, serious platform.
Did they name political positions to particular individuals?
Excuse me, sorry?
So it gets administered.
Yeah, sure. And sure. Well, okay. In the agreement as well, it's good that Haider reminds me about this. So one of the problems that took place in the 2010 elections is that there was some debathification, right? So there were some individuals who were debathified. Yeah, I'll finish this one story, and then I'll make my last point. Okay, which is there was this issue of debathification, and there was a specific individual, Salah al-Mutlaq, who has zero credibility, who was debathified on the basis that he was one day part of the Ba'ath Party. In the agreement, the Erbil agreement, they specifically mentioned that this individual will be de-Ba'athified, right? They'll be reintegrated into the political fold, but nothing about everyone else, right? It was just him, he was the only person that mattered, right? And obviously, because he was the one that was starting the dotted line. He didn't care about the hundreds of other people who were wrongly de-Ba'athified, some of them perhaps rightly, but many of them wrongly, right? None of that came in. It was really a betrayal. It was incredible. Anyway, and the final point is what Haider was saying, that there's some basis for the demagoguery and so on and so forth. I agree with that, but at the same time, I would say I think there's a different part of the story, which is that if there's fear of the Baathists today in some circles in Iraq, that's because people are not getting right and correct information about them. They're not being told the truth about the Ba'ath Party, which is that now it's completely decimated and it's become an utter joke, even in the circles that used to support them formerly. And I'm very familiar with those circles. I'm very, very familiar. I'm intimately familiar with them. The Ba'ath Party now has become this pathetic joke in those circles, right? But many people, in some circles in Iraq, are still terrified that the Ba'ath Party will come back, and I would be terrified of that too, if it was true. But there's absolutely no prospect of it. So if the people were given accurate information about the Ba'ath Party, about relationships with Iran and so on and so forth, I think that would be lessened. So the politicians are deliberately, exaggerating and deliberately creating this artificial threat, and I think it's just extremely sad and unnecessary. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, on that note, would you please join me in thanking our panel?